Hi, as Jill said, my name is Ann, and if you are seeing this pre-recorded, it's because our family of 4 is now a family of 5. So any day now, our baby girl is going to be coming. So I apologize if I'm not there in person, but this is our story. My husband, Jeremy, and I have been married for 11 years. We have a 10-year-old daughter, Hannah, and a 6-year-old son, Caleb. It was 6 years ago when Caleb started showing strange symptoms. He started having unexplained fevers with nothing else accompanying them, just high fevers, and they'd come and go. They'd go just as fast as they came on. We were told it was a virus and not to worry about it. But months went by and these fevers just kept coming, and I kept telling myself this is more than a viral infection, but we couldn't pin down what it was. In August of '09, he was admitted to the hospital with what they thought was leukemia. And after 3 days in the hospital, we were told, no, it's not leukemia, but it's some sort of viral infection. Months and months still went by with no answers. Finally, it was May 28th of 2010 that we received the diagnosis of hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis type 5. We refer to it as HLH. It took me months to be able to say his diagnosis. And actually, the first time his doctor said it, and we were all in the room, and Jeremy and I just looked at each other, and I couldn't help but laugh. It was like just this weird, I'm like, what did he just say? Was that English? Once he was diagnosed, it was less than 3 months to his bone marrow transplant. I'll never forget the day that he was diagnosed. I'll never forget who was in the room. It was Caleb's primary nurse and his doctor, my husband and I, and happy Caleb, and we were all in tears and crying and getting this news, and Caleb was this little 19-month-old baby who was happy and smiling and looking around and couldn't figure out why we were all so upset. So we've also found out that day that Caleb was a miracle, as his doctor called him. HLH is extremely rare and extremely fatal. We were told that the median survival rate at that time was 6 to 8 weeks if untreated. And Caleb had already made it 10 months from the initial symptoms. So for him to make it 10 months without any type of treatment was unheard of. You know, you go into a family's reality once a child is diagnosed with cancer or a similar disease. You'll hear new normal all the time, especially going into bone marrow transplant. You'll just constantly hear, it'll be your new normal. You'll adjust to your new normal. And to me, I just always thought, what does that mean? What is normal anymore and what isn't? And it was about a year ago when I posted something on Facebook about Caleb having to go in for sedation. And of course, family is all wondering what's wrong. And my response was, oh, it's nothing. It's no big deal. He just has a brain MRI and a lumbar puncture and a bone marrow biopsy. And it was another mom who we met along our journey, who has 2 children who had bone marrow transplants, and she laughed and she said, only us. You know, we're the only people in the world who would say that this is normal. And that's when it hit me, is that there is no new normal. There's different, and you adjust to a different life, but Caleb still has anxiety, he's still scared, and he should be. And I still have anxiety, and I have my days where I'm scared that it'll come back, and that's okay. And I don't think that any of that will ever be normal. So I think it's more just adjusting to a different life, and nothing about it is normal anymore. And that goes for parents and siblings and the children affected and grandparents and everyone affected by it. And your life is turned upside down. And I remember someone saying, "Oh, your life has just been turned upside down." And I thought to myself, it would be a lot easier if my life was turned upside down, because you picture a box and you tip it upside down and things are still relatively in the same order, just reversed. Getting this diagnosis and going from 2 healthy kids and adjusting to, being the mom of 2 and being working parents to all of a sudden having our lives change like this, it was more like having everything being shaken up, turned upside down, and then someone come by with a leaf blower and everything is, you don't know where to find it, and you don't know how to rearrange it to make everything okay again, and you don't know if you ever will. So that's how I kind of saw things when our family went through this. Your house really turns into, your house is just, the front door is constantly it's a revolving door. At least for us, we went from being, pretty private. I mean, we have our circle of friends who come over and neighbors and play dates and things like that, but we're not an overly, it's not every night that we're having people over. So we went from that to all of a sudden, it's every day, it's either nurses or PT or OT or speech. Every day there are multiple people coming in the house if you're not going out to those appointments. So even on the days where you get to kind of relax and stay home, you're never really relaxed, because there's always someone coming into the house. And that changes a lot of things too. With Caleb, it was quite an adjustment period, because he didn't know if someone was going to be coming to poke him or to play and sing songs with him. So we would always kind of laugh and liken it to our cat hiding under the bed, because he would go and hide under his bed, and we'd just have to say, he'll come out when he's ready. And he was kind of like that, skittish cat who, would kind of figure out what's going on and then slowly make his way out. Your days are filled with clinic appointments, being admitted to the hospital, discharging from the hospital. Being readmitted to the hospital is hard. You feel like you failed somehow, like you should have been able to keep your child safe at home, and you can't. The discharges, I know for us, it was terrifying that first day being discharged after transplant. The rest I was okay with. You kind of figure things out, and it's a lot of medications, but you make it work. But for me, it really hit me like a ton of bricks when we had been in the hospital for months, and all of a sudden I was responsible for IV lines and extremely strict medication schedules and all of this, and it was just me. And I remember telling the nurses, I can't do this. I don't want to do this. I want to be home, but I can't be responsible for this. It was terrifying. And, we did it, but some days I don't know how. And once you are discharged, then you have clinic appointments. In our situation, we were inside the 60-mile radius, so we were not allowed to stay at the Ronald McDonald House. So it was driving back and forth from White Bear to Minneapolis, which doesn't seem that far, but when it's every day, and then you have to pay for parking and gas. And like I said, it was every day for checks, and you never knew, is this going to be a 1-hour appointment, or are his labs going to be off and it's going to be a 9-10 hour appointment. And then you also have the stress of working, or in our case, a lack thereof. We went from a dual income working family down to one income overnight, because I thought I could keep working, but the simplest thing, just a GI bug, would land him in the hospital for a week. And that's when I realized I can't continue to work. I have to be in the hospital with my child. And FMLA is only 12 weeks. And when you're dealing with a diagnosis like this, like cancer and the treatment, or a bone marrow transplant, 12 weeks is a drop in the bucket. And we were very fortunate that my employer at the time told us that I would have a job to come back to when I was ready, but the majority of the parents that we met going through the same thing were not as lucky. And they were told by their employers, I'm sorry, but we can't hold your position. And so then you're faced with everything that's on your plate already, along with now not having a job to go back to. As far as assistance goes, we were in the same boat as a lot of other families, where because one spouse was working, we didn't qualify for anything. So it was really, really a struggle for a very long time. And in our case, we just ended up having to use credit cards as my income, just to buy groceries and the necessities to get by. And then on top of that, you have insurance and everything else to worry about. So those are huge stressors. And then another huge one is other children at home. In our case, Hannah was 5 at the time. She had just turned 5 when Caleb was diagnosed, and was getting ready to start kindergarten that fall. So we had the summer of that should have been school clothes shopping and supply shopping and all these fun things to get ready for her very first year of school, and it was so hard to focus on that. And as a parent, you feel like a failure because you can't. I wanted to do all those things, but I just couldn't. And so we relied heavily on grandparents and family to take her school shopping and make sure that she had those things, but I still, it rips your heart out. Knowing that with your first, especially she was our first child, and I had been looking forward to doing those things for years, and now there was no way to split my time to do it. Once she started school, she had been in school about a month when Caleb came home from the hospital. So then we had the stress of, how do we keep the house and everyone in the house germ-free when we've got a brand new kindergartner in the house? And so we would have her take off her shoes, her jacket, kind of strip everything down outside the back door. Backpack was left in the garage. She would take a shower, and for a little while we did the one kid upstairs, one kid downstairs, just to try to keep all the junk away, because as a new kindergartner she did get sick a lot. But we quickly realized that isn't really an option with 2 kids, especially 2 kids who have been separated that long. And so after a while, we just realized they needed to be together. It was more important for them to be together and just be careful about it than it was to keep them separated. And then along with school, as the child gets older, or if it's an older child going through it, it's educating the school and making sure that you have constant communication with the school nurse about meds and what other issues your child might have. For example, when Caleb started kindergarten just last fall, Thank goodness his nurse was aware of his background. But on the third day of school, he was playing on the playground, and he jumped off a platform only 2 feet off the ground, just playing, being a boy, having a good time. And he had a compound fracture in his humerus that came completely through his bicep. And, it's just things like that you don't think about, and down the road it's, it's weakened bones from steroids and things like that. Speaking of steroids, there are so many things that no one warned me about that I was completely unprepared for. Not only does your child change physically, Caleb went from looking like your everyday 18-month-old the end of May to by the very beginning, early July, he was unrecognizable. His hair had fallen out, and he had gained, I'm not even sure the exact amount, but he was about as wide as he was tall. And aside from the physical changes, it's the emotional changes. He was always an extremely laid-back kid. He was just, since the day he was born, he hardly made a peep unless he needed something. And as soon as he got that, he was good again. But the steroids caused him to completely do a 180. He was actually diagnosed with profound irritability, is what it says in his chart. We tried so many medications, none of them worked. There were times when my husband would come home from work at the end of the day and he would just hear screaming. Caleb would be standing in his room screaming, and I would be in the living room crying because there was nothing I could do. I would have to sit on him just to change his diaper, and walk away. If I tried to hold him or console him, he would scratch and bite me, and there was nothing I could do. And looking back, I think that was the hardest part, was just not having any control over it, and not being able to console my child. I think that was the hardest part, was not being able to console my child, not being able to do anything about it. And as a mom, that's my job. That's my number one job in the world, is to take care of my children, and I couldn't do it. So that was extremely hard. No one told me about the amount of meds, and that it's very, very time specific. We knew that there would be a lot of medications. Of course, anyone knows, if anyone has a diagnosis like that, the first thing you think of is all the pills that you have to take, all this, all that. But it was truly overwhelming. The amount of syringes that we went through in the first 24 hours that we came home after transplant. I actually had to take a picture of it because I thought, no one's going to believe this, that this is how many meds this poor kid has to take. And here I am setting my alarm and getting up 4 times every night to give it to him. And this is all along with all of the IV medications that he's taking. And line cares, and what goes into having a Hickman line, what you have to do with that, TPN, things like that, and then what's involved when there's a toddler involved in the equation. It definitely changes things. I'll never forget his primary nurse at Children's. The first his very first chemo infusion, nicknamed him Houdini, because within 5 minutes, Caleb de-accessed himself. And it was just one quick, that kid didn't need more than 2 seconds, and he had that needle in his hand. So we had to try a lot of different things, using multiple and different sized tegaderms and cath wraps at the same time, and having me never leave his side, and having to get a nurse if I had to go to the bathroom to watch where that kiddo's hands were. So when we switched over to the University of Minnesota for his bone marrow transplant, he received a double lumen Hickman line, which is normally hung at the chest. And I had reservations instantly about that, because our little guy was not going to be happy with having 2 lines constantly hanging out of his chest. But we were reassured that everything would be okay, and they do it all the time with kids of all ages, and that they would, put a couple extra sutures in and it would be safe. And so the night that it was placed, we were kept inpatient because Caleb had some pretty high, he was in a lot of pain, just due to it being pretty hard to place the line because of the sudden weight gain. And also they did a bone marrow biopsy, and his bones were so soft that it took about four different times to get a good sample. So he was really sore, so they kept him overnight for some pain medication. And it was midnight or around there when I woke up to screaming, just horrible, horrible screaming. And I jumped up, and he had pulled out his Hickman line. The cuff was almost all the way out. So they went in to fix it, and they ended up running it off of his right shoulder blade, so it came out his back now instead. So it was harder for him to play with and get a hold of. And so, like I said, she was definitely right when she named him Houdini. But what I was completely unprepared for was, after transplant, the drug cyclosporine causes excessive hair growth. And I've never seen anything like it until you're in the BMT world. I had no idea that this happened. But it's hair everywhere, all over his back, all over his arms, his face. Really the only place that he didn't get a lot of excessive hair growth was his chest, which makes sense why they hang it on the chest first. We learned the hard way that when it's on the back, dressing changes are excruciatingly painful. And so we had, I had asked that, I be trained in to do the dressing changes at home, and I realized very quickly that I couldn't do it. It was just too painful for him, and I couldn't do it, and I didn't want someone at the home doing it. I didn't want him to associate home with that kind of pain. So it was hard to kind of admit that I was completely wrong. But it's something that you have to do. It's, if you can't handle it, then you definitely have to speak up and let them know. So we ended up doing his dressing changes in clinic, and his primary nurse at the U would have me hold an emesis basin, and we would just have to, I would hold him still and hold the basin there, and she would pull it quick and change the dressing, and Caleb would vomit from the pain. It was so painful, and there was no way, we tried every different kind of swab and everything else, but it just made it even more painful because then it went slower. Another thing that we learned with the lines is that a toddler does not understand that lines don't go around their neck at night. So there was one morning where I walked into his room and he had his TPN tubing around his neck twice. And I called saying, what can I do? And I ended up coming up with the answer myself, which was using a cath wrap and then having it go inside his onesie and then making sure that he was in really tight-fitting cotton PJs that didn't have feet, and then running the tubing. So I'd run the tubing down his onesie, through the leg, and then put the pajamas on him so that at least the tubing was coming out by his foot and it would stay there. And then purchasing a video camera, a video baby monitor, and turning the volume all the way up so that if he was kind of making some noises, I had a good minute to get in there before he could get that tubing up anywhere near his neck. One of the worst things that we went through was when Caleb relapsed. He was doing absolutely fantastic, and everyone was so impressed with his progress. And out of the blue, he started having seizures. My husband called me. They were in the car. He had taken him to the grocery store at very, very early in the morning when it wasn't crowded, because we had finally gotten the green light to let him out of the house, let him go some places as long as he had a mask on. And they were on their way home, and my husband said, Caleb's just staring at the ceiling. And I can't get his attention, and I knew right away something was wrong. And I said, pinch him, or have Hannah pinch him, try to get his attention. And so he did, and he said it's not doing anything, and now he's drooling. So I told him to go straight home. He was within a mile from home, and call 911. And it took about 35 minutes to get that first seizure to stop. Right as they were pulling into Children's, the seizure stopped. Within 24 hours, he had pleural effusions. They had drained, within the first few hours, they had drained 400 mils off of his right lung. A few hours after that, actually that night, he had another seizure that lasted over 20 minutes. And by the next day, all of his organs were starting to be affected. At that point, we were told that if he made it 48 hours, it would be a very good sign that he would get through this, but not to, that they really didn't know, and that every time that HLH reactivates, it's harder on the body. And so we signed papers saying that even though we weren't sure what it was, we were going to start chemo and start treatment right away, hoping that that's what it was. And thank goodness he turned the corner pretty quick. When your child relapses, at least I felt like I failed as a parent. My husband and I just kept thinking, what did we do? Did we take him out in public too soon? What could we have done different? And looking back now, I don't think there really was anything different that we could have done, but you just can't help feel that way. Right along those lines, while we were in the hospital with him for his relapse, I acquired EBV, and I didn't know it at the time until I became more sick than I've ever been in my entire life. And I kept going into urgent care, and they kept telling me it was a viral infection and not to worry about it. But it kept getting worse and worse, and I did my best to stay away from the kids and have family and friends come over and help. But it got to a point where Jeremy actually had to carry me in. I they checked my blood, and my liver functions were through the roof, and I was covered in a rash head to toe. So I saw a liver specialist, and he said, I'll run your labs, but I don't really even need to look at them. You have classic EBV. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, Caleb started to get sick. And it's not that he was really sick, he just wasn't looking right. He was pretty lethargic, so I called his primary nurse at Children's and said, it could just be me, because now that Jeremy's home, he completely perked up and he's acting just fine, but he's just been off today. And she said, why don't you bring him in, trust your gut. In the half hour that it took to get there, by the time we got there, the whites of his eyes were completely yellow. I was having a hard time keeping him awake. When they checked his hemoglobin, it was, I want to say 3.6. It was under 4. And so he was brought straight to the PICU, and he ended up being transferred back to the University of Minnesota for autoimmune hemolytic anemia caused by EBV. And so to this day, I worry, I blame myself for that I should have. If I would have been the advocate for myself that I was for my son, maybe it would have been caught earlier and he wouldn't have had to go through all that. And so then he was put on steroids again. And as you can see by the picture, it's steroids, as awful as they are, there are some pretty funny times that come with it too. Like the picture of him, he couldn't decide between chocolate or vanilla, so he just decided to open up the freezer and get a gallon of each. And now we have fun. The kids swim at Grandma and Grandpa's pool all summer long. As you can tell, they're pretty good at having fun. We're getting back to our family traditions, which a huge one for us was going back to having a Christmas tree, a real Christmas tree. For a very long time during treatment and after transplant, there's no live plants in the house. So no flowers, no plants of any kind. So there was no Christmas tree for quite a long time. And so the very first year that we were able to go out and cut down our Christmas tree again, we did it. And we are definitely that family, you could say. This picture is from just this past Christmas, and Jeremy was cutting down the tree and handed the saw back. He probably thought it was me, and he just handed it back and he said, "Okay, take this." Well, it was Caleb. And so by the time I noticed, Caleb was trying to cut down the tree next to us, and I just shook my head and said, "Oh, we're always that family." We're getting into new routines. Caleb's been doing the sub-Q IgG now for about, I want to say 3 years now. It's been going great. It's just part of our Sunday routine, and he loves it because when it's his half hour of infusion time, he gets to be king of the remote, and no one else has a say as to what we watch. It's got to be, it's totally up to him. So he's pretty okay with it. And this is a picture from his last day of school, his kindergarten graduation, just this past June. So we are definitely getting back to our routines with work and school. It's been 5 years now since his transplant. So life is pretty much, as normal as it can be. Like I said, of course it's different, but it's a good different. When I did go back to work, I realized pretty quickly that although I liked my job and I was good at what I did, and I liked where I was, I just didn't have that feeling that it's what I was meant to do, that I was really making a difference at the end of the day. And so when a friend of mine told me about an open position at PHS, I decided, hey, you know, that would be a really good thing for me. Especially since I knew a little about PHS. That's where we've been getting Caleb's infusion supplies, and we've had infusion nurses in the past. And so now here I am working for PHS, and I love what I do, and I feel like every one of us here makes a difference, and it's huge when you've been on the other end, to know that when you leave at the end of the day, you've made a difference to a family, a huge difference. We are back to going on family trips. Caleb had to make a wish. He was 3.5 when his wish was granted, and his wish was to meet Buzz and Woody. So we went to Disney World and stayed at, Disney World. We stayed at Give Kids the World, and he was able to meet Buzz and Woody. So it was just a great week of no appointments and no treatments, and just having a great time. So that was kind of the first trip that kind of kicked off, okay, we can do this. We can get out of town and enjoy ourselves. We also go up to the cabin a lot. It's a year-round cabin, so we're either ice fishing, snowmobiling, four-wheeling, or they're swimming in the lake all summer. You can't keep them out of the water. Caleb went tubing for the first time this year, which was pretty huge. We all heard about it for about 6 weeks. And just exploring around the cities, going to fairs and festivals, doing things with Hope Kids, hiking in Taylor's Falls and going to Stillwater, just doing the normal family things that we once thought was so impossible, and now it just makes you appreciate it that much more. We're really getting back to a normal family life. In this next slide, it asks, how was your day today? A day in your life, what did you do today? So it could be, your alarm goes off, you get ready, maybe you've got kids to feed, get dressed, get off to school. Maybe there's an accident, so you've got traffic to deal with. So there's stressors like that I think happen to everyone. And looking back at a day in the life of a parent with a child with a diagnosis of cancer or something similar, just going through my normal day at the time. It was about 6 a.m. that my alarm would go off, and that was after being up for most of the night with alarms from the pumps. So you'd either have to silence them, or you'd have to call the on-call nurse to try to troubleshoot if you didn't know what was going on. And there was also making all of the midnight snacks for a kid with steroids, which luckily with Caleb, a lot of the times it was Cheerios, so there wasn't much food prep for that. But that wasn't always the case, and you could pretty much bank that it was 2 hours every night of eating, and there was nothing I could do to change it. He had to get up and eat for 2 hours every night. Then I would unhook all of his lines and do flushes and heparin locks. Get both kids dressed, get them fed and their snacks for clinic, because we'd always have to go to clinic. And so then we'd have to get from White Bear to Minneapolis. I'd usually try to get an 8:30 appointment, just because you never knew how long you were going to be there. And we learned very quickly that the earlier that you made the appointment, if he did need an infusion, you could still get home at the end of the day and you wouldn't have to stay inpatient overnight. So you learn all those little tricks. And if Caleb did need an infusion, once we got his lab results back, I would have to figure out, okay, who's going to come and get Hannah to get her to kindergarten? She was in PM kindergarten at the time. So it was starting to call family, friends, anyone who could get down to Minneapolis to get her back to school by 12:40. Then it was coming home, making dinner, doing homework with Hannah, getting the kids bathed and jammy time and books, you know, the normal, trying to keep as normal of a routine as we could for them. Get Caleb's lines hooked back up, get everything started, catch up on laundry if I could, and all the while making sure that I was giving him his medications, the correct dosage at the correct times. And so that goes from the second you wake up to the second you go to bed, and then actually throughout the night with alarms. But it's making sure that you have coolers for the ones that have to be kept refrigerated and everything else, and having everything pre-measured. And hopefully before we passed out, my husband and I would get to talk to each other. That didn't usually happen, but we would try every once in a while to talk to each other and see how our days were. And then usually the nights ended with lying awake and thinking about tomorrow. And how are we going to do this tomorrow? What's the plan going to be? What's it going to look like? So as you can see, there's lots to juggle. Emotionally, there's anger, fear, guilt, depression, uncertainty. As far as your time goes, it's completely unpredictable. You have appointments and planning and coordination. If you are working, you're trying to balance work schedules as well. I know my husband had huge guilt associated with time because of that. He had to work. And along with working, he wanted to visit us at the hospital. He wanted to spend time with our daughter. And he also had to do major improvements to our house. We had mold in our basement that we didn't know about. And once Caleb was diagnosed, it wasn't a safe place for him to be. Even though it was in the basement where we never were, it was black mold. So along with everything that he already had on his plate, he had to gut the basement, fix the moisture problem, and take care of all that before Caleb could come home from the hospital. So the poor man, I think he slept maybe 2 hours a night for the last couple months. Physically, you're sleep deprived, you're exhausted, your diet suffers, and then illnesses pop up because of everything adding up. Family, there's resentment within the family, and that's, I think that in our case it was with spouses and with siblings. As hard as you try, you can only do your best. Friendships definitely suffer. It was hard for us to accept a lot of help. And I think it was hard for our friends to understand why we weren't accepting of help. There are intrusions in your home, in your family. Things change. Date nights. I know some people are able to keep those up. We were one of the couples who it was very, very hard. Financially, there's time off work, insurance issues, medications, and bills, and all the things that I touched on earlier that go along with that.